What happens when the world's most unpredictable billionaire sits down with late-night television's most provocative host? You won't believe what unfolds when Elon Musk faces off against Bill Maher in a confrontation that spirals completely out of control. This isn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a full-scale verbal warfare that leaves one of them storming off set in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in what can only be described as television history in the making. The stage was set for what should have been another routine Friday night episode of Real Time with Bill Maher. The HBO studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy, cameras positioned perfectly, audience members settling into their seats, completely unaware they were about to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Elon Musk, dressed casually in his signature black t-shirt and jeans, sat across from Maher at the familiar curved desk, the two men exchanging pleasantries as the final technical checks were completed. But something felt different from the moment the cameras started rolling. There was an underlying tension in the air, a palpable sense that this wasn't going to be the typical tech mogul interview, filled with softball questions about electric cars and space exploration. Maher, known for his razor-sharp wit and willingness to push boundaries, had clearly come prepared with an agenda that would soon become apparent to everyone in that studio. So Maher began with his characteristic smirk, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had made a career out of making powerful people uncomfortable. Let's talk about your latest acquisition of Twitter, or X, or whatever you're calling it this week. You've turned what was once a somewhat civilized platform into what many are calling a cesspool of misinformation and hate speech. Care to explain how that serves humanity? The question hit like a sledgehammer, and you could see Musk's jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the typical introduction he was expecting. The billionaire shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the desk as he processed the deliberate provocation. "Well, Bill," Musk replied, his voice measured but with an edge that suggested he was already calculating his response. "I think you're operating from a fundamentally flawed premise. What I've done is restore free speech to a platform that was previously controlled by ideological gatekeepers who decided what Americans could and couldn't say." Maher's eyebrows shot up, and he leaned forward slightly, sensing blood in the water. "Free speech? Is that what you call it when your platform becomes a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and harassment campaigns? When journalists and activists are getting doxxed and threatened because your algorithm amplifies the most toxic voices?" The host's voice was rising slightly, his hands gesturing more animatedly as he pressed his attack. The audience was dead silent, sensing that this was already veering far from the typical celebrity interview format they were accustomed to. Musk's response came quickly, his own voice taking on a sharper tone. "You know what, Bill? I find it fascinating that someone who built their entire career on saying controversial things is suddenly concerned about toxic voices. Weren't you the guy who got canceled from your own show for making jokes about September 11th? Glass houses and stones, don't you think?" The reference to Maher's firing from politically incorrect landed like a bomb in the studio. You could feel the collective intake of breath from the audience. The sudden shift in energy as what had started as a pointed interview question had just become deeply personal. Maher's face flushed slightly, his trademark smirk faltering for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. "That's rich coming from someone who accused a cave diver of being a pedophile on Twitter because he hurt your feelings." Maher shot back, his voice now dripping with contempt. "At least when I make controversial statements, I don't have the power to manipulate global communication platforms to amplify my personal vendettas." Musk's composure began to crack visibly. His legs started bouncing under the desk, a nervous tick that those who knew him well would recognize as a warning sign. "You want to talk about manipulation, Bill? Let's talk about how your show consistently platforms the same establishment voices while pretending to be edgy and independent. You're as much a part of the system as anyone else. You just wrap it in jokes and call it rebellion." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Production assistants were exchanging worried glances from behind the cameras, unsure whether they should intervene or let this train wreck continue. The audience sat in stunned silence. many of them pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming an unprecedented moment in television history. Maher wasn't backing down. If anything, Musk's personal attacks seemed to energize him, bringing out the combative side that had made him famous. You know what I think your real problem is, Elon? You can't handle criticism. You're so used to being worshipped by tech bros and crypto fanboys that when someone actually challenges your Messiah complex, you lose your mind. Remember when you tried to back out of buying Twitter because you realized you'd bitten off more than you could chew? The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Musk's face was now visibly red, his hands clenched into fists on the desk. "My Messiah complex," he said, his voice rising dangerously. This from a guy who thinks making jokes about religion and politics on HBO makes him some kind of truth-telling prophet? You're a court jester, Bill. Entertainment for people who want to feel smart without actually thinking. The insult was devastating in its precision, striking directly at Maher's self-image as a serious commentator rather than mere entertainment. You could see the host's eyes flash with genuine anger, his professional composure beginning to slip away entirely. The careful balance of a television interview was disintegrating rapidly, replaced by something much more raw and dangerous. "At least I don't pretend my jokes are going to save humanity," Maher replied, his voice now cold and cutting. "When I mock politicians or celebrities, I'm not claiming it's going to get us to Mars or solve climate change. I'm honest about what I am. Can you say the same?" But as these words left Maher's mouth, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in the room. This was no longer a television interview that had gotten heated. This was a personal battle between two massive egos, each determined to destroy the other. And what was about to happen next would push both men far beyond the point of no return. That Musk's response came like a lightning strike, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow managed to fill the entire studio. "You want to talk about honesty, Bill? Let's be honest about what this really is. You're a has-been comedian who peaked in the 90s, desperately clinging to relevance by attacking people who are actually changing the world. When was the last time you did anything meaningful besides sit behind this desk and mock people who are building the future?" The words cut deep, and everyone in the studio could see Maher's carefully constructed persona beginning to crumble. His hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles went white, and for a moment, the seasoned host looked genuinely shaken. But Bill Maher didn't become one of television's most feared interviewers by backing down from a fight, and his counterattack was swift and merciless. "Building the future?" Maher laughed, but there was no humor in it, only venom. "You mean like when you promised fully self-driving cars by 2014? Or when you said we'd have 1 million robot access on the road by 2020? Or how about when you claimed Neuralink would cure paralysis by 2022? Face it, Elon, you're not a visionary. You're a carnival barker selling snake oil to techno-utopian suckers who want to believe in magic." The studio audience gasped audibly. This was beyond anything they had expected to witness. Some were still recording on their phones. Others sat frozen in shock, but all of them understood they were watching something unprecedented unfold. The production crew behind the cameras was in full panic mode, with the director frantically whispering into his headset, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this unprecedented television moment continue. Musk's face had gone from red to purple, his entire body tensing as if he was preparing to physically launch himself across the desk. "Snake oil?" he snarled, his South African accent becoming more pronounced as his anger peaked. "I've revolutionized 3 industries while you've been making the same tired jokes about Republicans and religion for 30 years. I'm sending rockets to space. You're sending audiences to sleep. At least my audience doesn't lose their life savings buying Dogecoin because I tweeted about it." Maher fired back without missing a beat. "At least I don't manipulate stock prices with my social media posts. At least I don't fire people for refusing to work 90-hour weeks in my factories. You want to talk about changing the world? You've changed it all right. You've made it a more toxic, divided place where rich boys can buy platforms and pretend their tantrums are free speech." The mention of Dogecoin and stock manipulation hit a particularly sensitive nerve. Musk had faced criticism and legal challenges over his social media influence on markets, and bringing it up in this context was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. He stood up abruptly from his chair, towering over the seated Maher, his hands pressed flat against the desk as he leaned forward menacingly. "You sanctimonious piece of garbage," Musk hissed, his voice barely controlled. "You sit here in your ivory tower, making millions by mocking people who actually take risks and build things. You've never created anything, never employed anyone, never put yourself on the line for anything bigger than your next punchline. You're a parasite, Bill, a leech feeding off other people's achievements." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Maher slowly rose from his own chair, meeting Musk's aggressive posture with his own defiant stance. The two men faced each other across the desk like gladiators in an arena, neither willing to back down. Both pushed far beyond the boundaries of civilized discourse. A parasite. Maher's voice was deadly quiet now, more dangerous than when he had been shouting. "I'll tell you who the real parasite is. It's the billionaire who takes government subsidies with one hand while claiming to be a self-made entrepreneur with the other. It's the guy who inherited wealth from apartheid emerald mines and then lectures the world about freedom. It's the man-child who can't handle being told no, so he buys entire companies just to fire the people who disagreed with him." The reference to his family's controversial background in South Africa was the final straw. Musk's composure shattered completely, his face contorting with rage as he pointed an accusatory finger directly at Maher's face. "You don't know what you're talking about, you ignorant fool. You're regurgitating lies and propaganda because you can't stand that someone actually succeeded while you've been stuck in the same mediocre career for decades." "Mediocre?" Maher laughed again, but this time there was genuine amusement mixed with the venom. "I've been on television longer than you've been relevant. I'll still be here making jokes when your companies crash and burn, when your rockets explode, when your cars kill people, and when the world finally realizes that the emperor has no clothes." The studio fell into absolute silence except for the sound of both men's heavy breathing. The tension was so thick it felt like the air itself might ignite. Camera operators held their positions, not daring to move or make a sound that might break the spell of this extraordinary moment. Even the most seasoned television professionals had never witnessed anything quite like this. Musk's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper, but filled with such intensity that every person in the room could hear it clearly. "You know what your problem is, Bill. You're jealous. You're a bitter old man who realizes he's accomplished nothing meaningful in his entire pathetic life. So you tear down people who actually matter. But here's the truth. In 50 years, nobody will remember your name, while I'll be remembered as the man who made humanity a multiplanetary species." But even as Musk delivered what he clearly intended as the killing blow, Maher's response was already forming, and it would prove to be the match that finally ignited the powder keg that had been building throughout this extraordinary confrontation. Maher's eyes narrowed to slits, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every insult, every slight, every moment of frustration that had been building throughout this disastrous interview. "Multiplanetary species? You can't even run a social media platform without turning it into a Nazi playground. You want to talk about legacy, Elon? Your legacy is going to be the man who bought the world's most important communication tool and destroyed it because your feelings got hurt by some journalists." The words hit Musk like physical blows. His face went from purple to nearly white, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he spat, but his voice was cracking. Now, the controlled anger giving way to something more desperate and unhinged. Twitter was dying under the old regime. It was a censorship machine controlled by activists and bureaucrats. "I saved it. Saved it." Maher's laugh was harsh and mocking. "You destroyed it. User engagement is down, advertising revenue has collapsed, and half the world now sees it as a cesspit of hate speech and misinformation. You didn't save anything. You killed it because you couldn't handle being criticized. You're the richest man-baby in history." That final insult, man-baby, seemed to break something fundamental in Musk's psyche. His entire body began trembling with rage, and when he spoke again, all pretense of intelligence or sophistication was gone, replaced by pure, primal fury. "You piece of shit. You worthless, talentless hack. I've accomplished more in a single year than you have in your entire miserable existence." The profanity shocked everyone in the studio. This wasn't just heated discourse anymore. This was a complete meltdown happening live on television. The production team was frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but the director, perhaps recognizing the historic nature of what was unfolding, kept the cameras rolling. Maher, sensing that he had finally pushed his guest past the breaking point, pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a master provocateur. There it is. There's the real Elon Musk, everyone. Not the genius inventor, not the visionary entrepreneur, just another rich brat having a tantrum when someone doesn't worship at his altar. This is who you really are when the mask comes off. Musk's response was immediate and devastating in its raw emotion. Shut up. Just shut your mouth. You insignificant little worm. You don't get to lecture me about anything. You're nothing. You're a joke. A failed comedian who thinks making fun of politicians makes him important. The billionaire's complete loss of composure was shocking to witness. Here was one of the world's most powerful men, reduced to screaming like a child having a playground argument. His carefully cultivated public image was disintegrating in real time, and everyone in that studio knew they were witnessing something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. But Maher wasn't finished. With the cold precision of a surgeon, he delivered what would prove to be the final, fatal cut. You know what the really pathetic part is, Elon? You're going to go home tonight to your empty mansion, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, and you're going to convince yourself that you won this argument. You'll tweet about it, claim I was biased, maybe even threaten to sue HBO. But deep down, in that hollow space where your soul should be, you'll know the truth, that tonight, everyone saw who you really are. The silence that followed was deafening. Musk stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, struggling to find words that wouldn't come. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, the man who always had an answer, who always had a comeback, who always had. The last word was completely and utterly speechless, and then something inside him snapped. You want to see who I really am? Musk screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. I'm the guy who's going to make sure you regret this for the rest of your pathetic life. I'll buy this network. I'll buy HBO. I'll buy everything you've ever touched and burn it to the ground. The threats were clearly empty. HBO wasn't for sale, and even Musk's vast wealth couldn't simply purchase major media conglomerates on a whim, but the intent behind them was terrifying. This wasn't hyperbole or heated rhetoric. This was a man with immense power and resources making genuine threats against someone who had embarrassed him. Maher, however, seemed completely unimpressed by the billionaire's bluster. And there it is, folks. When Elon Musk can't win an argument, he threatens to buy his opponent and destroy them. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future of free speech according to our guest. That final, devastating observation proved to be the last straw. Musk's face contorted with such pure rage that several audience members actually recoiled in their seats. Without another word, he ripped off his wireless microphone and hurled it across the studio with such force that it shattered against the back wall. "This interview is over," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the stunned studio. "I'm done with this garbage. I'm done with you." But as Musk turned to storm off the set, Maher couldn't resist one final parting shot. "Running away, Elon? That's what you do best, isn't it? Run away when things get tough, just like you tried to run away from buying Twitter when you realized what you'd gotten yourself into." Musk spun around one last time, his face a mask of pure hatred. "Go to hell, Bill. You and your entire worthless career can go straight to hell." With that, he turned and stormed toward the exit, his footsteps echoing loudly in the dead silence of the studio. But the drama wasn't over yet. As Musk reached the edge of the set, he suddenly stopped and turned back toward Maher one final time. For a moment, it looked like he might return to continue the argument, but instead, he simply stood there, staring at his tormentor with undisguised contempt. "You think you've won something here tonight," he said, his voice now eerily calm after the storm of rage that had preceded it. "But you have no idea what you've started. No idea at all." With those ominous words hanging in the air, Elon Musk finally turned and walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a shell-shocked production crew, and one satisfied host who had just achieved what many thought impossible. He had broken the richest man in the world on live television. As the exit door slammed shut behind the departing billionaire, Maher slowly sank back into his chair, a mixture of triumph and exhaustion written across his face. The studio remained in absolute silence for several long moments, as if everyone present was still processing what they had just witnessed. Finally, Maher looked directly into the camera and, with his trademark smirk slowly returning to his face, delivered the perfect closing line. Well, folks, I guess we now know what happens when you give a man-child $44 billion and a Twitter account. We'll be right back after this commercial break, assuming our guest doesn't buy the network before we return. And with that, one of the most explosive confrontations in television history finally came to an end, leaving viewers across the nation stunned, amazed, and already sharing clips of the unbelievable meltdown they had just witnessed.